He'd been sketching her face for 2 years, filling notebooks with drawings of a woman he'd never met. When she was attacked on a dark street, he didn't hesitate to save her. Now she's sitting by his hospital bed, and he has to decide whether to tell her the truth, that he's been in love with her since before he knew her name. Hello, beautiful soul family. Welcome back to another enriching story. Your unwavering support means the world to me, and I'm committed to bringing you even more heartwarming stories as I continue to grow and evolve every day. If you're joining us for the first time today, please drop a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to officially become part of our family. Now, let's get into today's story. The alarm didn't go off because Caleb Vance had never set one. He woke at 5:43 in the morning the way he always did, his body trained by 2 years of the same ritual, the same hunger, the same quiet desperation that pulled him from sleep like a fisherman reeling in his catch. The slum apartment was dark, cold in the way that poverty makes cold, the kind that seeps through walls and settles in your bones, no matter how many layers you wear to bed. He'd slept in a hoodie and sweatpants, his breath visible in the gray pre-dawn light filtering through the cracked window. He lay there for 37 seconds, counting them the way he always did, letting himself exist in the blank space before consciousness fully returned, before he remembered what his life had become, before he remembered what he'd lost, before he remembered her. Then he reached for his phone. The screen was cracked in a spiderweb pattern across the top left corner, a casualty from 4 months ago when he dropped it on the concrete outside the recycling center. He nearly wept at the damage, not because the phone itself mattered. It was 3 years old and barely functional on the best days, but because the crack obscured part of the screen where he watched her. He taught himself to angle it just right so the fracture didn't split her face in half. He turned it on now, waiting through the agonizing 10 seconds it took to power up. And then his fingers moved with practiced precision. YouTube app search history, the video he'd watched yesterday and the day before and the day before that, Sienna Thorne's keynote speech at the Tech Innovation Summit from 6 months ago. He'd watched it 83 times. He knew because he'd counted. The video loaded slowly, his internet connection barely strong enough to stream. And then there she was. Sienna Thorne filled his cracked screen in a red power suit that made her dark skin glow like she'd been carved from mahogany and polished by angels. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, her makeup flawless, her posture radiating the kind of confidence that came from building a tech empire before turning 30. She was 29 years old and worth $3.2 billion, and she was the most beautiful thing Caleb had ever seen. He propped the phone against the wall and sat up, reaching for the instant noodles he'd left on the makeshift nightstand, a cardboard box turned on its side. He lit the camping stove he used for cooking, the only heat source in the apartment, and watched her speak while the water boiled. "Innovation isn't about disruption for its own sake," Sienna said on the screen, her voice clear and strong and achingly familiar. "It's about seeing what's broken in the world and caring enough to fix it." Caleb whispered the words along with her. He'd memorized the entire speech. The noodles were ready in 10 minutes. He ate them slowly, savoring the warmth more than the taste, his eyes never leaving her face. She was talking about her company's new initiative to bring technology education to underserved communities. Her passion was evident in every gesture, every inflection. The audience was enraptured. So was he. When the video ended, he didn't replay it immediately the way he used to. Instead, he sat down his empty cup and reached under his mattress, pulling out the sketchbook. It was the nicest thing he owned, a proper artist's sketchbook with thick, textured paper, 120 pages, purchased 2 years ago when he'd still had $23 to his name. He'd chosen it over food that week. He'd never regretted it. He opened to a blank page near the back. The first 100 pages were full. Sienna from every angle he could capture from photographs and video stills. Sienna smiling, rare and genuine. Sienna in profile, her elegant neck, a curve he'd drawn so many times his hand knew the muscle memory. Sienna looking directly at the camera, her dark eyes intelligent and sad in a way Caleb recognized because he saw the same thing in his own mirror. He picked up his pencil, a cheap mechanical one he'd stolen from the community center, and began to draw her from memory. The video had shown her laughing at a joke from the moderator, her head tilted back slightly, her throat exposed, her expression unguarded for just a fraction of a second. He'd rewound that moment 7 times, studying it, burning it into his brain. His hand moved across the paper with the kind of precision that came from years of architectural training he was trying to forget. The curve of her jaw, the angle of her cheekbone, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when joy surprised her. He loved her. It was insane. He knew it was insane. You couldn't love someone you'd never met, someone who didn't know you existed, someone who lived in a stratosphere so far above your own reality that you might as well be a different species. You couldn't love a woman from watching her on a screen, from reading interviews, from studying the way she moved through the world with grace and power, and a loneliness she tried to hide. But he could see it. God, he could see it in every forced smile at every gala. Every moment her eyes went distant during conversations with people who only wanted access to her wealth. But he did love her, completely, hopelessly, the way monks loved God, with a devotion that required nothing in return. He finished the sketch in 22 minutes. It was good. They were all good. He had a gift, even if he'd buried it under 2 years of penance and poverty. Caleb touched the drawing gently, his fingertips tracing the line of her face, and then closed the book. He hid it back under the mattress, a secret too pathetic to share with the world, and got ready for work. The recycling center smelled like rot and chemicals and human desperation. Caleb had been working there for 18 months, sorting through trash for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, earning just enough to cover his rent and 2 meals a day if he was careful. His hands were scarred from the work, cuts from broken glass and sharp metal that never quite healed before new ones appeared. He didn't mind. The scars felt appropriate. At noon, he sat on the concrete ledge outside the facility with Jackson Reed, a 35-year-old man who'd lived on the streets longer than Caleb and had the wisdom that came from surviving what broke most people. Jackson was eating a sandwich from the shelter 2 blocks away. Caleb had his phone out watching a different video of Sienna. This one was from a business news interview. "Man's got it bad," Jackson said, not unkindly. He'd been teasing Caleb about his obsession for months, ever since he'd caught him sketching her during a break. "I know," Caleb said. He never denied it. There was no point. "You ever think about, I don't know, moving on? Finding a real woman you could actually meet?" Caleb looked up from the screen, where Sienna was discussing market trends with the kind of brilliant analysis that made his chest ache. "Why would I do that?" "Because she doesn't know you exist, brother. Because this—" Jackson gestured at the phone. "This isn't real." Caleb was quiet for a moment, watching her speak. "She's real," he said finally. And watching her, knowing she exists in the world, knowing someone that extraordinary is out there building things and changing lives and refusing to compromise, that gives my life meaning. That makes the trash and the cold and the loneliness bearable because I can see her and think beauty still exists, goodness still exists, she exists." Jackson shook his head, but his expression was soft. "You got a poet's heart in a garbage man's body. It's going to kill you someday. I'm already dead. Caleb said quietly. She just makes me feel alive for a few minutes a day. The conversation ended there because their break ended, and they went back to sorting trash. But Caleb thought about Jackson's words for the rest of the shift. It was true that loving Sienna was killing him in slow motion, the way beautiful things often killed you with exquisite precision and no mercy. But he'd been dead since Clara. Anyway, this was just a different kind of haunting. That evening, Caleb volunteered at the Riverside Community Center, teaching art to kids who lived in the same poverty he did. It was the only thing left from his old life that he allowed himself. This connection to creation, to beauty, to the possibility that broken things could still make something worthwhile. There were 12 children in the class tonight, ages 7 to 14, all of them carrying trauma in their small bodies the way soldiers carried shrapnel. Caleb set up the supplies, donated materials that were never quite enough, and let them draw whatever they wanted. He didn't believe in structured lessons. He believed in giving them space to express what words couldn't hold. A 10-year-old girl named Luna sat beside him working on a portrait of her mother. She was talented, her lines confident despite her age. Caleb watched her work, offering gentle suggestions when she asked, mostly just sitting with her in companionable silence. "Mr. Caleb," she said after a while, not looking up from her drawing, "have you ever been in love?" His hand stilled on the charcoal he'd been using for his own sketch, a habit he couldn't break, always drawing while they drew. "Yes," he said. "With who?" "With someone who doesn't know I exist." Luna looked up at him then, her dark eyes too old for her face. "That sounds sad." Caleb smiled, the expression feeling strange on his face because he so rarely used it. "Does it? Does it make you sad?" she pressed. "No," he said, and he meant it. "It makes me grateful." "Why?" "Because loving her, even from a distance, even knowing nothing will ever come of it, it reminds me that my heart still works, that I can still feel something other than emptiness. She's like a light in a dark room. I can't touch the light, I can't hold it, but I can see it. And seeing it is enough." Luna considered this with the seriousness children bring to important questions. "I think she's lucky," she said finally. "Even if she doesn't know it, someone loving you that much, that's lucky." Caleb's throat tightened. He reached over and squeezed Luna's shoulder gently. "Keep drawing," he said. "Your mom is going to love this." He stayed late after class, helping clean up, walking some of the younger kids to the bus stop. The November air was bitter, winter coming early to Washington, D.C., and he pulled his threadbare jacket tighter as he headed toward his apartment. He was thinking about stopping at the convenience store. He had 4:30 left until Friday. Maybe enough for... He stopped walking. There was a television in the window of an electronics store, one of those displays showing multiple screens at once, and on the largest screen was Sienna. She was at some kind of event, a gala maybe, wearing a dress that made her look like the stars herself. Emerald green, sleek, devastating. Her hair was down tonight, falling in waves over her shoulders. A man was beside her, handsome in that generic way wealthy men were handsome, perfectly groomed and forgettable. The Chiron at the bottom identified him as Julian Blackwell, her fiancé. Caleb had known she was engaged. He'd known for 8 months since the announcement. He'd watched the press conference where she'd smiled and said all the right things about partnership and shared vision and commitment. He'd watched it and felt nothing because, of course, she was engaged. Of course, she was building a perfect life with someone appropriate, someone from her world. It didn't change anything. He didn't love her less. He didn't want her less. He just loved her the way you loved the sun, admiring from a distance, accepting you'd burn if you got too close. But watching her now, seeing the way she stood just slightly apart from her fiancé, seeing the careful smile that didn't reach her eyes, seeing the loneliness he recognized, because it matched his own. Caleb felt his chest constrict with an ache that had become familiar. I've loved you from a distance for so long that having you close feels like a dream I'm terrified to wake up from, he whispered to her image on the screen, knowing she couldn't hear, knowing it didn't matter. An employee inside the store was staring at him like he was crazy. Maybe he was. Caleb turned and walked away. That night, he took his anxiety medication before bed, his hands shaking as he shook out the pill. The bottle was almost empty. He'd need to figure out how to refill it soon, but the free clinic was overwhelmed, and the wait list was 3 months long, and he'd been rationing them for weeks. He swallowed the pill dry and lay down in his bed, pulling the thin blanket up to his chin. Before he closed his eyes, he looked at his phone one more time. The last photo he'd saved from earlier today, Sienna leaving her office building. She was looking down, her expression unguarded, and she looked so unbearably sad that his heart broke all over again. "Good night, Sienna," he whispered to the photograph, the way someone might pray. 3 miles away in a penthouse overlooking the Capitol, Sienna Thorne stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows and felt crushingly, devastatingly alone. Her apartment was beautiful in the way magazine spreads were beautiful. Sterile, perfect, cold. Everything was designer, expensive, curated by someone she'd paid to make her living space reflect success. The furniture was Italian leather. The art was original from artists whose names carried weight. The view was worth millions. She hated it. She stood there in silk pajamas that cost $800, coffee in a handmade ceramic mug, looking down at the city waking up beneath her. Thousands of people starting their days, living their small, messy, real lives. She envied every single one of them. Her phone buzzed. Mila, her assistant, with her schedule for the day. 9 meetings, 2 conference calls, a working lunch, a charity dinner. Tomorrow would be the same. Next week would be the same. Next year would be the same until she died, successful and accomplished and utterly empty. She touched the window glass, her palm flat against it, and felt the cold seep into her skin. She was separated from the world by more than just glass. She was separated by money, by fame, by the pedestal everyone had put her on, and she'd climbed willingly, desperately, trying to prove she was worth something after her mother died and left her with nothing but a trust fund and the certainty that love was temporary, but success was forever. Except success was lonely. Success was a penthouse with no one to share it. Success was a fiancé who kissed her cheek with affection, but no passion, and she felt nothing. Sienna closed her eyes against tears she didn't understand and didn't have time for. She had a board meeting in 2 hours. She needed to be flawless. She was always flawless. She wondered if anyone ever saw past it. The business dinner that night was at Le Diplomate, expensive French cuisine for wealthy people playing at culture. Sienna sat across from Julian and discussed merger strategies and social calendars, and all the practical things their relationship had become. He was handsome, brilliant, appropriate. He came from the right family, understood her world, never demanded more than she could give. He was perfect on paper. "The Henderson acquisition should close by January," Julian said, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. "Your uncle is concerned about the optics." "My uncle is always concerned," Sienna said. She wasn't hungry. She never was at these dinners. "He means well. He means to control me." Julian looked up at her, his gray eyes thoughtful. "You could always tell him no." "Easy for you to say." She didn't mean for it to sound bitter, but it did. They finished the meal in companionable silence, the kind that came from years of friendship, because that's what they'd been before the engagement. Friends who made sense together. When he walked her to her car, he kissed her cheek the way he always did, gentle and chaste. Good night, Sienna. Good night. She sat in her car after he left and touched her cheek where his lips had been. She felt absolutely nothing. No warmth, no desire, no connection, just expensive perfume and the ghost of obligation. She cried on the drive home and hated herself for it. Caleb didn't mean to be in that part of the city. He'd volunteered for a late shift at a different community center across town, filling in for a teacher who'd gotten sick, and he'd stayed later than planned, helping a kid work through a panic attack. By the time he left, it was nearly 10 at night, and he'd missed the last bus that ran near his neighborhood. He started walking. It was 14 miles. He'd walked farther. The streets got worse the farther from downtown he went. Gentrification giving way to forgotten neighborhoods, the kind politicians promised to revitalize and never did. Caleb kept his head down and his hands in his pockets and thought about Luna's drawing. How proud she'd been showing it to him. How her face had lit up when he told her it was beautiful. He thought about Sienna's interview from this morning, the one he'd watched during his lunch break. She talked about legacy, about building something that mattered beyond profit margins. Her voice had been passionate, alive, and he'd fallen in love with her all over again. He was so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice the car. It was a Mercedes, sleek and black, and wildly out of place on this street. It was pulled over to the side, hazard lights blinking weakly. As Caleb got closer, he could see someone in the driver's seat. A woman, her posture tense. He would have walked past. He'd learned in 2 years of poverty that getting involved in other people's problems usually just created problems for yourself. But then he saw her try to start the car, saw it fail, saw her hit the steering wheel in frustration, and he saw the group of men notice her, too. There were 5 of them emerging from an alley like rats from a sewer. Caleb recognized the type immediately. Opportunistic predators who survived by taking from anyone weaker. The leader, a man Caleb knew by reputation as vain, had a crowbar. They approached the Mercedes from different angles, surrounding it. Caleb's heart started pounding. This wasn't his business. This was the kind of situation that got you killed in this neighborhood. He should keep walking. The woman in the car locked her doors. One of the men tapped on her window with the crowbar, almost playful. The others laughed. Caleb took 3 more steps, trying to convince himself to leave. And then the woman turned her head toward the noise. The streetlight caught her face. Time stopped. Sienna Thorne was 50 feet away from him, and she was terrified. Caleb's body made the decision before his conscious mind could catch up. He pushed through the gathering crowd of onlookers, people drawn by potential violence the way moths were drawn to flames, and he stepped between the thugs and her car. "Leave her alone," he said, and his voice shook, but his stance was solid. Vane turned to look at him, surprise flickering across his face before it settled into amusement. "This your woman?" "No, but she's not yours either. Walk away." "You walk away, hero, before you get hurt." Caleb didn't move. He couldn't because Sienna was right there. The woman he'd loved for 2 years, the woman who gave his colorless life meaning. And there were men with weapons surrounding her car, and every instinct he had was screaming to protect her, even though he was 6'3" and 160 pounds, and hadn't been in a fight since high school. "I'm not leaving," he said. Vane's smile disappeared. "Your funeral." The first hit came fast, the crowbar swinging toward his ribs. Caleb tried to dodge, but he was too slow, too unpracticed, and the impact drove the air from his lungs in an explosion of pain. He went down hard, his knees cracking against the pavement. "Get up," his brain screamed. "Get up! She needs you! Get up!" He got up. The second hit caught him across the shoulder, spinning him sideways. The third was a fist to his face, his lips splitting, blood filling his mouth with the taste of copper and failure. But every time he fell, He dragged himself back up and put his body between them and Sienna's car door. He could hear her screaming, muffled by the glass, her voice high and terrified. He could hear her on the phone, frantic, begging for police. He just needed to buy her time. A kick to his stomach doubled him over. Another to his back sent him sprawling. His vision was swimming. His ribs were on fire. Every breath was agony. He saw Clara's face, her smile before the accident, her eyes going blank after. He'd failed her. He'd been driving and he'd failed her. And she'd died. But he wouldn't fail Sienna. He got up again. Vane was done playing. He pulled a knife, the blade catching the streetlight, and Caleb's fear spiked to something beyond rational thought. But he didn't move. He stood there swaying, bleeding between the knife and the woman he loved. "You're either stupid or crazy," Vane said. The knife came at him in a quick, brutal arc. Caleb threw himself forward instead of away, inside the strike, and felt the blade slice across his ribs instead of plunging into his chest. The pain was white-hot, blinding, and he went down for the last time. Sirens wailed in the distance. "Getting closer." "Cops, let's go," one of the other men said, and they scattered like cockroaches, leaving Caleb crumpled on the ground in a spreading pool of his own blood. He heard a car door crash open, heard footsteps running toward him, felt hands on his face, small and soft and shaking. Oh God, please stay with me, please." Caleb opened his eyes, or tried to. One was already swelling shut. Sienna Thorne was kneeling beside him, her hands framing his bloody face, tears streaming down her cheeks and landing on his skin like rain. She was touching him. She was real. She was here. You're Sienna," he whispered, because his brain wasn't working right, and that was the only thought he could form. "Do you have your cell phone? Anyone I can call?" She sobbed. "Why would you do this? Why would you risk your life like that? You're going to be okay. Do you hear me? You're going to be fine. Please just stay awake." He wanted to tell her everything, that he loved her, that he'd loved her for 2 years. That dying here with her hands on his face was more than he'd ever thought he'd get. But the words wouldn't come. The darkness was pulling at him, insistent and heavy. "Worth it," he managed instead, his voice barely audible. You're worth it." Her face was the last thing he saw before the world went black. Sienna cradled this stranger's head in her lap and felt something crack open in her chest that had been sealed for years. His blood was soaking through her designer dress, warm and sticky. His face was destroyed, bruised and swelling and wrong. She didn't know him. She didn't know his name, but he'd just taken a beating that would probably kill him. Taken a knife meant for her, and she was feeling something she hadn't felt in so long. She'd forgotten what it was called. Connection. This broken, bleeding man had looked at her like she mattered more than his own life. The ambulance arrived in a chaos of lights and noise. Paramedics tried to pull her away so they could work, and she fought them. Actually fought them, screaming that she wouldn't leave him. "Ma'am, we need space." "I'm not leaving him." They loaded him onto a stretcher, his body limp, his breathing shallow. One of the paramedics was saying something about internal bleeding, about trauma, about needing to move fast. Sienna followed them to the ambulance in a daze. "Are you family?" someone asked. "Yes," she lied without hesitation. They let her ride with him. She sat in the cramped space while they worked, their hands efficient and urgent, and she held his hand, the only part of him she could reach. His fingers were calloused, scarred, the hands of someone who worked hard for little reward. They were beautiful. "What's his name?" a paramedic asked, trying to check his wallet. But there was barely anything in it. A few dollar bills, an expired ID from 4 years ago. What does it matter? Save his life first, Sienna yelled, shame flooding through her. This man had saved her life, and she didn't even know his name. At the hospital, they wheeled him straight to surgery. Sienna stood in the hallway covered in his blood and watched the doors swing shut behind him. And for the first time in 8 months, she forgot she was engaged. She forgot she had a board meeting tomorrow. She forgot everything except the terrifying, overwhelming thought that if this stranger died, something vital and irreplaceable would die with him. Mila found her 2 hours later, still standing in the same spot, still covered in blood. Sienna, Jesus, what happened? I need you to find out everything about him, Sienna said, her voice hollow. Everything? Who he is, where he lives, find out every single detail. The surgery took 6 hours. Punctured lung, internal bleeding, cracked ribs, concussion. The surgeon told her he'd lost a lot of blood, that the next 24 hours were critical, that she should go home and rest. She didn't move from the waiting room. Mila brought her clean clothes, coffee, her laptop. Sienna changed in the bathroom, scrubbing his blood from her hands and watching it swirl down the drain, feeling like she was washing away evidence of something important. When they finally let her see him, he was in a private room because she demanded it and paid for it up front. Cost irrelevant. He looked small in the hospital bed, his face bandaged, his chest wrapped, machines beeping steadily around him. He was alive. Sienna pulled a chair to his bedside and sat down. She studied his face, trying to understand. He was younger than she'd thought in the chaos. Maybe early 30s. Even battered and bruised, there was something gentle about him, something beautiful in the architecture of his bones. She found herself reaching out to brush a strand of dark hair from his forehead, then pulled back, startled by the impulse. "Who are you?" she whispered to his unconscious form. He didn't answer. She stayed anyway. Julian called 17 times over the next 2 days. Sienna ignored every call. Mila fielded her meetings, rescheduled everything, and brought updates on the stranger who'd saved her life. His name was Caleb Vance, 32 years old, formerly a registered architect, though his license had lapsed 4 years ago. Currently employed at a recycling facility, lived in the slums. No family, no emergency contacts, no connections to anyone or anything. He was completely alone. Sienna read the sparse report Mila had compiled and felt her heart clench. There had to be more. People didn't just appear fully formed from nothing. But Mila said that's where the trail went cold. 4 years ago, Caleb Vance had essentially erased himself. On the 3rd night, Sienna fell asleep in the chair beside his bed, her laptop still open on her knees. She woke at 3 in the morning to find herself covered with a blanket. A nurse must have done it. The hospital was quiet, just the beep of monitors and the whisper of air through vents. She looked at Caleb, still unconscious, still fighting, and she started talking. "I don't know if you can hear me," she said quietly. "They say people can hear when they're like this. I don't know if that's true or just something we tell ourselves to feel less helpless." She paused, feeling foolish, but continued anyway. "I'm Sienna, but I guess you probably knew that if you were trying to help. Everyone knows who I am. It's lonely, actually, being known by everyone and understood by no one." The words surprised her. She never said things like that out loud. "I built an empire to prove I was worth something after my mother died. Everyone said I was too young, too inexperienced, too emotional. So I became hard, focused, perfect, and I won. I proved them all wrong. But now I'm trapped in what I built, and I can't remember the last time someone touched me with tenderness instead of ambition." She laughed, the sound bitter. "I'm engaged to a man I don't love. I have everything I thought I wanted, and I'm so lonely I can barely breathe sometimes." She looked at his hand, resting on top of the blanket, and slowly reached out to place her palm near his. Not touching. Just close. "I don't even know your name," she whispered. "But I can't leave until you wake up. I need to see your eyes open. I need to know who risks their life for a stranger. Because in 3 days of sitting with you, I felt more at peace than in 3 years of my life, and I don't understand why. I don't understand any of this." In the early morning hours, still unconscious, Caleb's fingers twitched. They brushed against hers just barely, just enough. Sienna held her breath, her heart hammering. His hand relaxed again, still lost in whatever dreams or darkness held him. But for a moment they'd touched, and Sienna sat in the quiet hospital room, holding the hand of a man whose name she'd just learned, and felt less alone than she had in years. Caleb woke to softness and light and pain. The pain came first, actually. A full-body scream of agony that told him he was definitely alive, because the dead didn't hurt like this. His ribs were on fire. His face felt like it had been rearranged. His head pounded with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. He tried to open his eyes. One cooperated. The other was swollen shut. The room was wrong. Too bright, too clean, too expensive. For a confused, floating moment, he thought he'd died, and this was some waiting room before judgment. All white walls and beeping machines, and the smell of antiseptic instead of sulfur. Then he saw the flowers. The room was filled with them. Roses, lilies, they covered every available surface, made the air thick with perfume. Panic set in fast and sharp. This was a hospital room. A nice hospital room, the kind that came with bills he couldn't pay in 3 lifetimes. He tried to sit up, and agony stopped him, driving him back into the pillows with a gasp. He needed to leave now before the debt crushed him worse than Vane's crowbar had. He scrabbled for the call button, his movements clumsy and desperate, and that's when he heard her voice. "Mr. Blackwell, I don't care what the board thinks is appropriate. Cancel the meetings. I'm not discussing this again." Caleb went still. That voice. He knew that voice. He'd heard it hundreds of times on videos, in interviews, in speeches he'd memorized. But it was different in person. Richer, with undertones the phone speakers couldn't capture. He turned his head slowly and saw her through the partially open door. Sienna Thorne stood in the hallway, her phone pressed to her ear, wearing jeans and a simple sweater he'd never seen her wear in any public appearance. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked tired. She looked beautiful. She looked real. She was here. She was really, actually here, 15 feet away from him, arguing with someone about staying at the hospital, staying for him. The memories came back in a rush. The car, the men, the beating, her face above him crying, her hands on his skin. He'd saved her. He'd actually saved Sienna Thorne. And now she was here. And he was still wearing a hospital gown, and his breath probably smelled like death. And oh God, this was not how this was supposed to go. Sienna ended the call with enough force that he heard the beep from his bed. She stood there for a moment, her shoulders tight with tension, and then she turned to walk back into his room. Their eyes met. Time suspended in that impossible moment. Her lips parted in surprise, her eyes widening, and Caleb couldn't breathe, and it had nothing to do with his injured lung. "You're awake," she said, and her voice broke on the words. She rushed to his bedside, setting down the coffee she'd been holding, her hands hovering over him like she wanted to touch but didn't dare. "Are you in pain? Should I call the nurse? How do you feel?" Caleb tried to speak, but his throat was desert dry. She noticed immediately, reaching for a cup of water on the nightstand, bringing it to his lips with one hand, supporting his head with devastating gentleness. The intimacy of it made his heart stutter. Her hand was on the back of his head. Her face was inches from his. She smelled really good, and he was drinking water. She was helping him drink, and this was the most erotic thing that had ever happened to him. He managed 3 sips before pulling back, gasping. "Thank you," he croaked. "No, thank you," she said calmly, setting down the cup but not moving away. She stopped, her composure cracking, tears welling in her eyes. Caleb stared at her, overwhelmed. "Why are you still here?" She looked at him like he'd asked the stupidest question in the world. "Where else would I be? You've been unconscious for 4 days. I needed to see you wake up." 4 days? Surgery complications. It was bad, really bad. Her voice was shaking now. "You could have died." He tried for a smile and felt his split lip crack. He winced. She took a breath. Her hand was on the bed beside his, close enough that he could feel her warmth. "I'm Sienna," she said unnecessarily. It almost made him laugh, except laughing would probably kill him. "I know who you are," he said softly. "Everyone knows who you are." "What's your name?" He'd never wanted to lie more in his life, to be someone impressive, someone worthy of the way she was looking at him, but he'd never been good at lying. "Caleb Vance." "Caleb," she repeated, and the way she said his name made him believe he could be someone worth loving. The way she said his name made his chest ache with something that had nothing to do with cracked ribs. "You should go," he said, even though the words hurt worse than his injuries. Your fiancé is probably worried and I have to figure out how to pay for all this." Her expression shifted to something fierce. "Everything's taken care of. Every bill, every treatment, all of it. You don't owe anyone anything." "I can't let you do that." "You already did. It's done, and it's not up for discussion." She sat on the edge of his bed, close enough that her hip pressed against his leg through the blanket, close enough that he could smell her shampoo. "I need you to stay, Caleb. Not because you owe me, not for debt or obligation, but because—" She paused, seeming to gather courage. "Because in 4 days of sitting with you, I felt more at peace than in 3 years of my life, and I need to understand who you are, why you did it. I need—" The door opened and a man walked in. Expensive suit, perfect hair, the kind of handsome that came with personal trainers and skincare routines. Julian Blackwell. Caleb recognized him from the news. "Sienna, finally," Julian said, and his voice was warm but tired. "I've been calling for days." He noticed Caleb then, his expression shifting to polite concern. He crossed to the bed, extending his hand before realizing Caleb was too injured to shake it, and settled for a nod instead. "You must be the man who saved my fiancé. Julian Blackwell. I can't thank you enough." The word fiancé landed like a punch, Caleb's face carefully emptied of expression. A skill he'd learned in poverty, hiding hope before it could be used against you. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "You're a lucky man." Sienna's expression flickered with something. Disappointment, maybe regret. But Julian was already talking about the attack, about security, about ensuring this never happened again. He was professional, appropriate, grateful in the way wealthy people were grateful to service workers who did their jobs. Caleb let the words wash over him and felt the distance between his world and Sienna's stretch to infinity again. Of course she was engaged. Of course she had a perfect life with a perfect man. Of course the moment where she'd sat on his bed and looked at him like he mattered had been charity, gratitude, nothing more. "We should get you to the gala," Julian was saying to Sienna. "You've been here for days. You need to get back to your life." Sienna looked at Caleb, her eyes searching his face. "I'm fine," Caleb interrupted, his voice flat. "You should go. Thank you for everything." The dismissal was clear. Sienna's face fell, but she nodded slowly. Julian's hand was on her lower back, guiding her toward the door, and Caleb watched the woman he loved walk away from him for what he assumed was the last time. She stopped at the door, turning back. "I've arranged for your recovery care and a place to stay afterward. You can't—" She paused. "You can't go back to where you were living. It's not safe. You don't have to, I know, but consider it an appreciation gift." She pulled out a card from her purse, crossing back to his bedside to place it on the nightstand. "My private number. If you need anything. Anything at all." Her fingers brushed his hand when she set down the card, and electricity shot through him, sharp and unmistakable. Their eyes met, and he saw her breath catch, saw her pupils dilate, saw the same shock of connection cross her face. Then Julian was calling her name, and she was leaving. And Caleb was left alone in his expensive hospital room, staring at a business card with her number like it was a holy relic. He picked it up with shaking hands and pressed it to his chest, right over his broken ribs, and let himself cry. 2 weeks passed. Caleb was discharged to an apartment Sienna had arranged, a modest one-bedroom in a safe neighborhood that felt like a palace compared to the slum. It was furnished, stocked with food, paid for 6 months in advance. The guilt of accepting it warred with the desperate relief of having clean water and heat. He found work at a community center in the area, teaching art to at-risk youth. The pay was minimal, but it fed something in him that had been starving. And Sienna texted him. It started simple. "How are you healing?" He stared at the message for 20 minutes before responding. "Better. Thank you for the apartment. I really appreciate it." Then, a few days later, she sent a photo of a disastrous coffee spill across her desk with the caption, "Morning meetings should be illegal." Despite himself, he laughed. Then he sent a reply. The texts became regular. Good morning messages, photos of interesting things they saw during the day, memes that made them think of each other. The formality melted away, and they began really talking. Sienna shared frustrations about impossible board members and the pressure of running an empire she'd built too young. Caleb shared stories about the kids he taught, their resilience and creativity despite circumstances that should have broken them. She asked about his past. He deflected, not ready to talk about Clara, about the accident, about the guilt that had driven him into poverty. He asked why she worked so hard. She admitted she didn't know how to stop. That achievement was the only value she'd been taught to measure. The late-night conversation stretched longer. One night, they texted for 3 hours about everything from architecture to favorite books to childhood dreams. Neither acknowledged how inappropriate it was, an engaged woman having intimate conversations with another man. Neither could stop. One evening, 3 weeks after he'd been released from the hospital, Sienna showed up at the community center unannounced. Caleb was in the middle of teaching, helping a 13-year-old boy with perspective drawing, when he heard Mila's voice at the door, asking if Caleb Vance worked here. He looked up and saw Sienna walking into the room, still in a business suit, her hair pulled back, looking like she'd stepped out of his dreams and into his reality. Every child in the room stopped what they were doing and stared. "Miss Thorne," Caleb said, standing too quickly and wincing as his still-healing ribs protested. What are you doing here?" "I was in the neighborhood," she said, a lie so obvious it was almost charming. Her office was across town. "I wanted to see where you work." The kids exploded with whispers. Everyone recognized her. She was famous in a way that transcended social circles. Caleb introduced her, trying to keep his voice steady, and she charmed them immediately. She asked about their art, really looked at it, offered genuine praise. She asked questions that showed she was listening. The children adored her instantly. She stayed for the whole 2-hour class. She sat beside Caleb at the art table, their shoulders touching because the stools were close together, and watched him teach. He was hyper-aware of every point of contact, every accidental brush of her arm against his, every time her breath caught when he leaned close to look at a student's work. "You're gifted with them," she whispered during a moment when the kids were absorbed in their projects. "They listen to you because you teach so well." Caleb turned to respond and realized how close their faces were. 6 inches, close enough to count her eyelashes, to see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, to feel her breath on his lips. "You walk into a room, and suddenly nothing else exists," he said quietly, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Not my past, not my pain, just you." Her eyes widened, her lips parting, and for a heartbeat he thought she might close the distance. "Mr. Caleb," a small voice interrupted, "is Miss Sienna your girlfriend?" They sprang apart like they'd been burned. Sienna laughed awkwardly, a sound he'd never heard from her before, nervous and unsure. "No, sweetie, just friends." But her voice wavered on the word friends. The class ended, and Caleb walked her to her car. The parking lot empty now. The November evening cold and dark. The streetlight cast them in a warm glow that felt intimate, private. "Thank you for letting me crash your class," Sienna said, lingering by her car door, neither of them moving to end the conversation. "You're welcome anytime. The kids loved you." Silence stretched between them, thick with everything unsaid. Caleb shoved his hands in his pockets to keep from reaching for her. "Can I ask you something?" Sienna said finally, her voice small. "Anything." "Do you ever regret it? Saving me? Do you wish you'd just walked past?" The question stunned him. He stepped closer without thinking, his response immediate and fierce. "I'd do it again 1,000 times." The intensity in his voice made her eyes well up. She reached out and squeezed his hand just for a second, her fingers warm against his cold skin. It was enough to set them both on fire. She pulled away quickly, fumbling with her car keys. "Right, of course," he said, brushing his hand through his hair. She got in her car but didn't start it immediately. She sat there gripping the steering wheel, and Caleb stood in the cold and watched her through the window. Finally, she drove away. Caleb remained in the parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at the hand she'd touched, feeling the ghost of her fingers on his skin, and knew with absolute certainty that he was falling deeper into love with a woman he could never have. 3 weeks into their friendship, Caleb could barely function. Loving Sienna from afar had been a safe fantasy, painful but contained. Knowing her, being near her, texting her every day, and seeing her smile and hearing her laugh, and learning all the ways she was even more extraordinary than he'd imagined. It was exquisite torture. He lay awake every night, replaying moments. The way she'd looked at him in the art class, the catch in her breath when their shoulders touched, the pressure of her hand in his for those 2 brief seconds. He was losing his mind. Sienna attended a charity gala with Julian, one of a dozen they were obligated to appear at each year. She wore a designer gown that cost $20,000 and felt like a costume. Julian was attentive in his careful way, making sure her champagne glass was always full, introducing her to donors and politicians with practiced ease. They danced together because it was expected. His hand on her waist was polite, appropriate, completely devoid of passion. When the song ended, he kissed her temple gently. "You seem distracted tonight," he said. "Sorry, I had a lot of work this past week." It wasn't a lie. She was exhausted from pretending, from smiling at people who only saw her bank account, from wearing this ring that felt heavier every day, from wanting to be somewhere, anywhere else. From wanting to be with Caleb. At 2 in the morning, slightly drunk on champagne and desperately lonely in a ballroom full of people, Sienna excused herself and called him. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice sleep-rough and concerned. "Sienna, what's wrong?" Just hearing him say her name made her chest ache. "Nothing's wrong. I'm sorry for waking you. You never have to apologize. I'd wake up for you any time." The simple sincerity in his voice almost broke her. "Where are you?" "Some gala, it's—" She laughed, the sound bitter. "I'd rather be at the community center with you and the kids than here. The hours I spend with you are the only time I feel like myself." She heard him sit up, heard the rustle of sheets. "Caleb, I had a dream about you," she continued, the champagne loosening her tongue, demolishing her filters. "You were sketching my portrait, and you told me you loved me." She paused, her heart pounding. "In the dream, I said it back." The silence on the line was deafening. When Caleb spoke again, his voice was raw, wrecked. "What do you wish would happen if it wasn't a dream?" Sienna closed her eyes, leaning against the wall outside the bathroom, tears sliding down her cheeks. The truth was pushing at her throat, demanding release. "This isn't just friendship," she whispered. "I can't pretend anymore anyway." "I'd say the same thing, Caleb. I'd choose the man in the dream over the life I have. And I'm terrified because I've never felt like this before." She heard his sharp intake of breath, heard what might have been a sob, and then she heard him start to speak, his voice shaking with emotion he wasn't hiding. "I've been in love with you since before I knew your touch, and now that I do, I'm ruined for anyone else. Every time you look at me like that, I forget how to breathe, and I don't want to remember. You're not just in my heart, Sienna. You're in my blood, my bones, every breath I take. You're everywhere, Sienna." Julian's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Are you ready to leave?" She jerked away from the wall, her voice changing instantly, sobering. "I have to go." "Wait, Sienna." She hung up. She stood there shaking, Julian waiting 10 feet away with her coat, the ghost of Caleb's confession echoing in her ears. She'd just crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Caleb didn't sleep after the phone call. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling while Sienna's words played on repeat in his mind. Her voice soft and broken and real, admitting she felt something too. That she'd choose him over her perfect life. That she was terrified. He was terrified too because he'd been lying to her from the beginning, not explicitly but by omission, which felt worse somehow. She thought their connection had started the night he saved her. But he'd been in love with her for 2 years before that. He'd watched her, studied her, sketched her face dozens of times before they ever met. She needed to know the truth, all of it. Even if it made him sound obsessive, even if it made her run, she deserved honesty. At 7 in the morning, he texted her. "Can we talk?" "Somewhere private." Her response came 3 minutes later. "Yes." "When?" "Today, please." Today, she suggested a park by the Potomac River, secluded and quiet. They agreed to meet at 2 in the afternoon. Caleb spent the intervening hours in a state of controlled panic. He showered 3 times, changed his clothes 4 times, trying to find something that didn't scream poverty but also didn't look like he was trying too hard. He settled on jeans and the one decent sweater he owned, a gray pullover that was only slightly worn at the elbows. He brought the sketchbook, the one filled with drawings of her, evidence of his obsession, his devotion, his 2 years of loving her from afar. He put it in his backpack. The park was nearly empty when he arrived, the December cold keeping most people indoors. Sienna was already there, standing by the water's edge in a long black coat, her hair down and windswept. She looked nervous. She looked beautiful. "Hi," she said when he approached, and her voice was uncertain in a way he'd never heard before. "Hi," he responded. They walked in silence for a while, following the path along the river. The water was gray and choppy, reflecting the overcast sky. Caleb's heart was hammering so hard he was sure she could hear it. Finally, he stopped at a bench overlooking the water. "Can we sit?" She nodded, and they sat, leaving a careful foot of space between them. The distance felt like miles. Caleb took a deep breath and started talking. "I need to tell you something about the night I saved you. About everything before that." His hands were shaking, so he clasped them together. "It wasn't a coincidence. Me being there that night, your car breaking down was a coincidence, but me recognizing you, me stepping in, that was—" He couldn't look at her. He stared at the river and forced the words out. "I've been watching you for 2 years, not in person. I never followed you or anything creepy like that. But on TV, in interviews. I'd watch your speeches, your public appearances. I started because I saw you on the news and thought you were brilliant. The way you talked about innovation and purpose, it meant something to me when nothing else did." He risked a glance at her. She was listening, her expression unreadable. "It became more than admiration. I have this sketchbook. I'd draw your face from memory, from screenshots of videos, over and over. I know how insane that sounds. I know. But you gave my life meaning when I had nothing else. Watching you, knowing someone that extraordinary existed in the world, it made the poverty and the loneliness bearable." He pulled the sketchbook from his backpack and set it on the bench between them. "There are 147 drawings of you in here from before we ever met. I loved you, Sienna, for 2 years before I knew your touch. And when I saw you that night in the car, surrounded by those men, I didn't think. I just knew I'd do anything to protect you." He finally looked at her fully. Tears were streaming down her face, silently. "I'm telling you this because I can't keep lying by omission. These past weeks getting to know you, it's been the greatest and most painful experience of my life, because you're even more extraordinary than I imagined. Every conversation, every text, every moment with you feels like breathing after drowning. And I can't keep pretending this is just friendship when my heart stops every time you smile at me." His voice broke, but he pushed through. "I'm in love with you, completely, hopelessly. I know it's wrong. I know you're engaged. I know I have no right, but I can't keep lying. I needed you to know the truth. And if you want, if this is too much, I'll disappear from your life completely. I'll never contact you again. You deserve to know who I really am before you decide anything." The silence after his confession was agonizing. Sienna sat frozen, tears running unchecked down her face, the sketchbook untouched between them. Then she stood abruptly, turning away from him, her arms wrapped around herself. He could see her shoulders shaking. Caleb's heart shattered. He'd gone too far, revealed too much, scared her away with the intensity of his devotion. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice hollow. "I shouldn't have. I'll go." "No." Her voice was strangled. She turned back to him, her face devastated. "Don't apologize, don't leave. Just give me a second because I can't process this." She walked a few steps away, taking deep breaths, clearly trying to compose herself. Caleb sat on the bench, feeling like he was waiting for execution. When she came back, her eyes were red, but her voice was steadier. "You can't say these things. You can't tell me you've loved me for 2 years, that you've been drawing me, that every moment with me feels like breathing, when I'm supposed to get married in 6 weeks, when my life is planned out, when this, whatever this is between us, it can't exist." "I know," Caleb said quietly. "That's why I said I'd leave if you wanted." "I don't want you to leave." The words burst from her like a confession. "That's the problem. That's the worst part because I feel it too. She sat back down beside him, closer this time. Close enough that their knees almost touched. I've been lying to myself, pretending this was just gratitude, just friendship. But I think about you when I wake up and when I fall asleep. I look for your texts before I check my emails. Being with you feels like coming home to a place I've never been. She picked up the sketchbook with trembling hands and opened it. The first drawing was from 2 years ago, one of his earliest attempts. Sienna at a press conference looking fierce and focused. She turned the pages slowly, seeing herself through his eyes, page after page of devotion rendered in pencil and charcoal. "I'm terrified," she whispered, still looking at the drawings, "because I'm supposed to love Julian. He's perfect on paper. He's safe. But when you look at me, I feel seen in a way I never have before. Like you're not looking at the billionaire or the CEO or the public figure. You're looking at me." She closed the book carefully and met his eyes. "What do we do now?" Caleb's chest was so tight he could barely breathe. "I don't know. I'm not asking you to leave him. I'm not asking you to choose me. I just needed you to know the truth. Is there any universe where we have a chance?" The question was barely audible. "You deserve someone who looks at you like you are the most important person in their life," Caleb said, his voice fierce. "I can be that man. I already am. But I have nothing to offer you except myself. I'm broke. I'm damaged. I live in an apartment you pay for because I can't afford my own rent. Any future with me it's uncertain and messy and nothing like the life you have planned." "I don't care about the money," Sienna said. "I need you to understand that. I don't care about any of it. But I have obligations, contracts. The engagement involves business partnerships, family expectations. It's not as simple as just calling it off." "I know." "I need time," she said, her eyes searching his. "To talk to Julian. To figure out what's real versus what I thought my life should be. To see if there's a way through this that doesn't destroy everything." "How much time?" "I don't know. A few weeks, maybe. Will you wait for me?" "I would walk through fire, take 1,000 knives, live 100 lifetimes in poverty just for one moment of being loved by you," Caleb said, the words raw and honest. "I'll wait as long as you need." Sienna reached out and took his hand, lacing their fingers together. The touch sent electricity through him, sharp and perfect and devastating. They sat there by the river holding hands, both of them crying quietly. The space between them finally bridged, but the future still impossibly unclear. 1 week of silence. 7 days that felt like 7 years. Caleb didn't text, and Sienna didn't call, both of them giving each other space while internally screaming. Caleb threw himself into work with desperate intensity. He taught extra classes, volunteered at 3 different community centers, stayed busy every waking hour to exhaust himself enough to sleep. It didn't work. He lay awake every night, remembering the feel of her hand in his, the devastated hope in her eyes, the impossible weight of waiting. Jackson noticed he was falling apart. "You look like death warmed over, brother. When's the last time you ate?" "This morning." A lie. It had been yesterday. "You're wasting away over that woman." "I know. Is she worth it?" Caleb thought about Sienna's laugh when he'd sent her a stupid meme at midnight 3 weeks ago about the way she'd sat with the kids at the art class, really seeing them. About her confession that being with him felt like coming home. "Yes," he said simply. "She's worth everything." Sienna was equally wrecked. She was distracted in meetings, short with staff. Her focus was shattered. Mila finally cornered her in her office on the 5th day. "Okay, what's going on? You've been a mess all week." Sienna looked at her assistant, her friend, the only person who might understand, and broke. I'm in love with someone who isn't my fiancé. Mila's eyes widened, but she didn't look shocked. Caleb, how did you… Sienna, I've worked for you for 4 years. I've never seen you look at Julian the way you look at that man. Mila sat down across from her. The real question is, what are you going to do about it? I don't know. The engagement? It's complicated. The board expects it. My uncle pushed for it. There are contracts involved. Contracts can be broken. Expectations can be defied. Mila leaned forward. Do you love Julian? The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. No, Sienna whispered. I love him as a friend, but there's no passion, no fire. I agreed to marry him because it made sense, because he was safe, because the board approved, because I was tired of being alone and he was available. That's not a reason to marry someone. I know. Sienna put her head in her hands. I know. I need to talk to him. End this before it goes any further. Even if things don't work out with Caleb, I can't marry Julian feeling like this. So talk to him. Sienna picked up her phone with shaking hands and called her fiancé. Julian, can we meet? There's something important we need to discuss. His voice sounded strange when he answered, almost relieved. Yes, I need to talk to you too. There's something I should have told you a long time ago. They arranged to meet at a quiet restaurant that evening. Julian offered to drive. His car was in the shop, so he'd borrowed Mila's SUV, and he'd pick up Mila on the way since she lived near the restaurant. Sienna said she'd meet them there. She spent the afternoon rehearsing what she'd say, how to explain that she cared for him but couldn't marry him, that she'd met someone else, fallen for someone else, chosen someone else. It felt cruel no matter how she framed it. At 6:30, she got in her car and started driving toward the restaurant. At 6:42, Julian ran a red light. He was distracted, rehearsing his own confession, the truth he'd been hiding for 5 years. He didn't see the truck until it was too late. The impact was catastrophic. Metal screaming, glass exploding, the SUV spinning and crumpling like paper. Mila screaming in the passenger seat. Julian's head slamming against the steering wheel despite the airbag. The world tilting and screeching and ending in a cacophony of destruction. Then silence. Then sirens. Caleb was walking home from the community center when he saw the emergency vehicles converging 3 blocks away. Smoke rising against the darkening sky. The organized chaos of first responders. A crowd gathering. He almost walked past. Accidents happened in the city every day. It wasn't his business. But something made him look closer. He saw the SUV first, crumpled beyond recognition. Saw Mila being pulled from the wreckage, conscious but bleeding, screaming for Julian. Saw the paramedics working frantically on the driver's side where the impact had been worst. Then he saw the third vehicle. A black Mercedes with a license plate he recognized because he'd memorized it from news footage. Sienna's car. His blood turned to ice. The world slowed to a crawl. Time became viscous, heavy, each second stretching into eternity. He was running before his conscious mind caught up, shoving through the crowd, his heart a drumbeat of terror and denial. Not again, not again. Please God, not again. Sienna! Her name ripped from his throat like a prayer. He reached her car, the driver's side crushed from a side impact, and saw her slumped over the steering wheel. Blood matted her hair. Her eyes were closed. She wasn't moving. Every nightmare he'd had since Clara's death came flooding back. The accident 4 years ago. The way Clara's eyes had gone blank. The way he'd screamed her name over and over while the EMTs told him there was nothing they could do. The way his hands had been covered in her blood, and he'd known it was his fault for being the one driving. No, no, no! He tore at the car door, his hands slipping on the handle, his strength fueled by pure terror. A police officer tried to pull him back, and Caleb shoved him away with violence he didn't know he possessed. The door finally gave. He reached in, his hands shaking so badly he could barely function, and carefully tilted her head back. Her eyes fluttered open. The relief hit him so hard he almost collapsed. "Sienna." "Caleb." Her voice was confused, slurred. What happened?" "You were in an accident. I'm going to get you out, okay?" He unbuckled her seatbelt with fumbling fingers and slid his arms under her, cradling her against his chest as he extracted her from the wreckage. She made a sound of pain, and he nearly broke. He carried her away from the car and sank to his knees on the pavement, holding her, his tears falling on her face. Paramedics rushed over, but he couldn't let go, couldn't release her. His arms locked around her like if he just held on tight enough, he could keep death from taking another woman he loved. "Sir, we need to examine her." "I'm not leaving her." His voice was raw, broken. I can't. "Caleb, please." Sienna's hand came up to touch his face weakly. "It's okay. Let them help." "I'm terrified of losing you," he choked out, the confession spilling from him unchecked. "I'm more terrified of never telling you that you're the reason I started believing in second chances. When I saw your car, when I thought you might be, I can't lose you." "You won't," she whispered. "I'm here. I'm okay." They had to physically pry him away so the paramedics could work. He stood 3 feet away, his whole body shaking, watching them check her vitals and stabilize her neck and load her onto a stretcher. When they started to take her to the ambulance, he followed. "Are you family?" someone asked. "Yes," Sienna said before anyone else could answer, her voice weak but certain. He's mine. Let him come." They let him ride in the ambulance. He sat beside her, gripping her hand like a lifeline, his other hand stroking her hair with a gentleness that contradicted his earlier violence. "You're going to be okay," he kept saying over and over like a mantra. "You're going to be fine. I've got you. When I hold you, I feel like I'm holding my entire world, and I'll protect it with everything I am." At the hospital, they tried to separate them so the doctors could work. Caleb became almost feral, his eyes wild, his hands reaching for her even as nurses blocked his path. "Sir, you need to let us do our jobs. I need to stay with her." "Caleb, please." One of the nurses, an older woman with kind eyes, put her hand on his arm. "You're scaring the other patients. She's in good hands. We'll take care of her, but you need to calm down." He was breathing too fast, on the edge of a full panic attack, his trauma from Clara bleeding into the present until he couldn't separate past from now. The nurse guided him to a chair and made him sit, made him put his head between his knees, made him breathe slowly while she talked in a low, soothing voice about nothing important, just filling the silence until his heartbeat slowed. When he could think again, she brought him water and told him Sienna had a severe concussion and a broken collarbone, but would fully recover. She was stable. She was safe. Caleb put his face in his hands and sobbed. They let him see her 2 hours later. She was in a hospital bed, her head bandaged, her arm in a sling, looking small and vulnerable in a way that made his chest ache. But she was alive. He walked to her bedside on shaking legs and just stood there, memorizing the rise and fall of her chest, the steady beep of the heart monitor, the evidence that she was real and breathing and here. "Hi," she said softly and tried to smile. It came out as more of a grimace. "Hi." His voice was wrecked. "You saved me again." "I'll always save you. Every time. As many times as it takes." She reached for his hand with her good arm, and he took it, sitting carefully on the edge of her bed. "They told me about Julian," she said quietly. 2 broken legs, internal injuries. He's in surgery, but they think he'll be okay. Mila has a fractured arm. Everyone's going to survive. I'm glad. He meant it. Despite everything, he didn't wish harm on anyone. I was on my way to end the engagement when it happened, Sienna said, her eyes searching his face. I'd made my choice before the crash. I choose you, Caleb. I choose love over obligation. I choose this terrifying, uncertain thing between us over the safe life I'd planned. Caleb couldn't speak. His throat had closed completely. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, his tears wetting her skin. I need to tell you something, too, he managed finally. About why I reacted the way I did when I saw your car. He took a shuddering breath and told her about Clara, about his best friend from 4 years ago, about the car accident where he'd been driving, about how she'd died and he'd survived. And the guilt had eaten him alive until he'd given up everything, his career, his money, his life, because he couldn't bear to be happy after killing the woman he'd cherished. I fled to D.C. to disappear, he said. The words painful but necessary. I wanted to be no one, to fade into poverty and anonymity because it felt like what I deserved. And when I saw your car today, I thought I was living my worst nightmare again. The terror that I'd lose another woman I loved, that my presence in people's lives is somehow cursed. Sienna cupped his face with her good hand, forcing him to meet her eyes. It wasn't your fault. Not Clara's death and not this accident. You didn't cause either of them. And love isn't a curse, Caleb. You saved my life twice. You've given me more in a few weeks than I've had in years. You're not cursed. You're the bravest, most beautiful person I know. I have nothing to offer you, he whispered. I'm barely surviving. I don't know how to be someone's partner when I can't even take care of myself. I'd give up everything I have for you, Sienna said fiercely. But I have nothing, so I'm giving you the only thing that matters, my whole heart, for as long as you'll have it. Caleb almost laughed through his tears. I think that's supposed to be my speech. Then say it to me. Say all of it, everything you've been holding back. He leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers carefully, mindful of her injuries. You could have anyone. Kings, billionaires, men who could give you the universe. But none of them will love you the way I do. Completely, desperately, forever. The way you say my name makes me believe I could be someone worth loving. You are worth loving. So much more than you know. He kissed her then, soft and careful and absolutely perfect. Her lips were warm and salt from tears, and she tasted like hope and second chances, and everything he'd thought he'd lost when Clara died. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers and whispered, I don't need forever. I just need tonight, tomorrow, and every moment you're willing to give me. I'll make them count. You already have. Mila wheeled herself into the room an hour later, her arm in a cast, a bandage on her forehead, but her eyes bright and alert. She took one look at Caleb and Sienna, his hand holding hers, their faces turned toward each other, and smiled. About damn time, she said. Sienna laughed, the sound turning into a wince as it jarred her injuries. How are you feeling? Like I was in a car accident, but alive, so I'll take it. Mila's expression turned serious. Julian made it through surgery. He's stable. But Sienna, he was on his way to tell you something important. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd make sure you knew. What's that? Mila glanced at Caleb, hesitating. Maybe this should be private. He can stay, Sienna said immediately, tightening her grip on Caleb's hand. Whatever it is, he can hear it. Julian asked me to tell you that he understands, that he's known for weeks you were falling for someone else, and that he's grateful because it gave him courage to admit his own truth. Sienna looked confused. What truth? He said to tell you he's sorry he wasn't honest from the beginning, that the engagement was a mistake, and that when he's recovered, he has something to confess that changes everything. 2 days later, Julian was well enough for visitors. Sienna went to his room, Caleb waiting in the hallway, giving them privacy but close enough that she could feel his presence. Julian was propped up in bed, his legs in casts, looking exhausted but oddly peaceful. When Sienna started to apologize, to explain about Caleb, he held up his hand. "Stop, I know, and I need to tell you something I should have told you 3 years ago." He took a deep breath, and the words came out in a rush. "I'm gay. I've been in love with someone else, a man named Jasper who works in London. For 5 years. The engagement to you was never real. It was an arrangement." Sienna sat down heavily in the visitor's chair, her mind reeling. "What?" Julian's voice was gentle but firm. "After your mother died, your uncle and the board started pressuring you to settle down, to appear stable. They threatened to oust you from your own company. Remember? They were going to use your history of anxiety and depression against you, claim you were unfit to lead." She did remember. The month after her mother's funeral, when she could barely function, and Arthur had called that emergency board meeting when they'd questioned her stability, her judgment, her right to run the company she'd built. "I offered you a solution," Julian continued. "A marriage of convenience. I'd provide the stable, appropriate image they demanded. You'd protect my inheritance. My family they're conservative, old money. If they knew I was gay, they'd disown me, cut me off completely. I planned a comfortable, passionless life together. Both of us lonely but safe. Both of us hiding from the truth." Julian's eyes were sad but clear. "But then the attack happened. And I watched you fall for Caleb. Really fall. I saw you come alive in a way I'd never seen. I watched you laugh for real, not the performance laugh you do at galas. I watched you risk everything to sit by his hospital bed, and I realized we were both condemning ourselves to half-lives." Sienna was crying silently. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was a coward. Because the lie was easier than the truth. Because I thought safety was enough." He shifted in his bed, wincing. "But the accident, almost dying, it gave me perspective. I'm done pretending to be someone I'm not. I'm calling off the engagement. I'm coming out. I'm going to fight my family and live honestly, even if it costs me everything, Sienna. And you should do the same. Fight for your company and your love. Stop letting other people dictate who you should be." He smiled, and it was genuine. "Go get your man, Sienna. Caleb is clearly crazy about you. Honestly, his devotion is almost annoying in how heroic it is." Sienna laughed through her tears. She leaned forward carefully and hugged him, mindful of both their injuries. "I'm so sorry you felt you had to hide. I'm sorry I let you hide too." When she wheeled back into the hallway, Caleb stood up immediately, his expression anxious. She crossed to him, and he caught her, holding her carefully, his hands gentle on her back. "I'm free," she whispered against his chest. "Truly free. The engagement was never real. It was protection, not love. And Julian is ending it. She pulled back to look at Caleb's face. "I can be with you, really be with you, if you still want." He kissed her, deep and certain and perfect, in the middle of the hospital hallway. Let the nurses stare. Let the world watch. This was real, and it was his, and he was never letting it go. 1 week passed. Sienna recovered enough to return to work. Though her doctor advised light duty, she ignored the advice and called an emergency board meeting. The boardroom was tense when she walked in, Caleb's presence beside her causing whispers. She'd brought him deliberately. She wanted them to see her choice. Her Uncle Arthur sat at the head of the table, looking smug. He'd heard about the broken engagement. He thought he had ammunition. "Sienna, we're concerned about recent events," he began. "Your broken engagement, your erratic behavior, He glanced at Caleb with barely concealed disdain. Questionable company you're keeping. We've done our research on Mr. Vance, formerly a licensed architect who lost everything 4 years ago. Currently living in poverty, history of mental health struggles, a dead fiancé under suspicious circumstances. Arthur opened a folder and slid photographs across the table. Public records from Clara's accident, medical records showing Caleb's anxiety medication. He's an unstable drifter, Sienna, and your involvement with him calls your judgment into question. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Some looked sympathetic, others looked calculating. We're invoking the clause from 3 years ago, Arthur continued, questioning your mental fitness to lead. Your recent behavior, the broken engagement, your obsession with this man, it all points to instability. We're giving you 1 week to decide. Step down voluntarily, or we'll force a vote to remove you. The room went silent. Sienna stood slowly, her eyes blazing. You want to question my fitness to lead the company I built from nothing? Fine, let's talk about fitness. Let's talk about the fact that I turned a $5 million investment into a $3 billion empire before I turned 30. Let's talk about our market position, our innovation pipeline, our employee satisfaction ratings. She leaned forward, her hands flat on the table. Or do you want to talk about the fact that I'm in love with a man who has nothing material to offer me? Is that what makes me unfit? Choosing love over your approval? Arthur's face hardened. You're thinking with your heart instead of your head. That's exactly what we're concerned about. Caleb had been silent until now, sitting beside Sienna, trying to be invisible. But hearing himself weaponized against her, seeing the contempt in these people's eyes, something in him snapped. He stood up. You're right, he said quietly. All eyes turned to him. I have nothing. I live in an apartment she pays for because I can't afford my own rent. I work at a community center making barely enough to eat. I have a past I'm ashamed of and trauma I'm still working through. He looked at Sienna, his voice softening. But I love her more than I've ever loved anything in my life, and she makes me want to be better, to build instead of hide, to create instead of just survive. He turned back to the board. If loving someone who sees past your money to your heart is a liability, then I'm the biggest liability she has. But I won't let you use me to destroy her. I'll walk away right now if it means she keeps what she built. No. Sienna's voice was sharp. She stood beside him, taking his hand. You're not going anywhere, and neither am I. She addressed the board with steel in her voice. I'm restructuring this board. Anyone who voted to question my fitness will be removed. If you fight it, I'll take the company private. Even if it costs me billions, I will not negotiate on my right to my own life. You can't, Arthur sputtered. I can and I will. This is my company, mine, and I'm done living a half-life to please people who see me as an asset instead of a person. The door opened, and Julian entered in a wheelchair, his lawyer beside him. She's right. And I'm here to confirm that our engagement was a mutual arrangement, not a romance. I support Sienna completely. Furthermore, I'm prepared to testify that Arthur attempted to blackmail both of us into maintaining the engagement for business reasons. Mila came in behind him, her arm still in a cast, carrying a thick folder. I also have documentation of Arthur's unauthorized access to Sienna's medical records, his attempts to manipulate board votes, and his personal communications discussing how to maintain control over her decisions, all potential legal violations. The tide shifted visibly. Several board members who'd been neutral now looked uncomfortable. One stood up and addressed Arthur directly. I didn't sign on to control Sienna's personal life. I invested because she's brilliant. This has gone too far. 3 others nodded in agreement. Arthur stood abruptly, his face red with fury. You're making a mistake, all of you. This company needs stability, not romance. Then leave, Sienna said calmly. Because I'm not going anywhere. He stormed out, 2 loyalists following him. The remaining board members looked at each other, then at Sienna. What do you need from us? The oldest member asked. Trust, and the freedom to live my life while running this company. Can you give me that?" They voted 7-0 in favor of her staying. Sienna found Caleb in the hallway afterward, sitting on a bench with his head in his hands. She sat beside him and took his hand. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Offer to leave." "Yes, I did. I won't be the reason you lose everything." "You're not a reason I'd lose anything. You're the reason I fought to keep it." She turned his face toward hers. They kissed in the hallway outside the boardroom where she'd just fought for her right to love him, and it felt like victory. The final board meeting happened 1 week later. Sienna stood before the investors, the press, and her remaining board members with Caleb in the front row watching. She gave the speech of her life. "I built this company to prove I was worthy after my mother died, to earn value through achievement, to show the world I was more than my grief, more than my youth, more than people's low expectations." Her voice was strong, clear. "But I finally understand that my worth isn't in this company. It's intrinsic. I don't have to earn the right to exist, to love, to be happy." The room was silent. "I'm in love with a man who's been through hell and came out the other side still capable of gentleness, still capable of giving everything he has, which isn't much materially, but is everything that matters. He makes me want to be better, to build things that matter beyond profit margins, to remember why I started this company in the first place." She turned back to the board. "So you can support me, the whole me, personal life included, or you can leave. But I'm not negotiating my humanity anymore." 3 more board members resigned on the spot, unwilling to accept her terms. The rest stayed. The press coverage was brutal for about 48 hours. Billionaire CEO chooses poverty-stricken artist over empire. The think pieces wrote themselves. Social media exploded with opinions. Sienna ignored all of it. She was too busy falling in love. 6 months later, Caleb stood in front of the building that would change everything. His first major architectural project since Clara's death. A memorial art center funded by Sienna's foundation, designed by him. It was beautiful. 3 stories of glass and light and open spaces designed for creation, for community, for healing. His hands had drawn every line of the blueprints. His vision had shaped every room. He'd named it the Clara Memorial Center for Arts and Hope. Sienna stood beside him at the opening ceremony, their fingers intertwined. She'd stepped back from daily company operations to focus on philanthropy. She'd never been happier. The crowd was massive. Formerly homeless individuals Caleb had helped, kids from his art classes, community leaders, press, donors, people whose lives had been touched by what Sienna's money and Caleb's vision had created together. Julian attended with Jasper, his boyfriend of 4 months, finally public and free. They looked incandescent together. Mila took photos, documenting everything, already planning the foundation's next project. Jackson was there too, wearing a new jacket Caleb had bought him, his eyes suspiciously wet as he looked at what his friend had built. Luna, the little girl from Caleb's first class, tugged on his sleeve. "Mr. Caleb, do you still think you're unworthy of good things?" Caleb looked at Sienna, at the center he designed, at the community gathered around them. He thought about how far he'd come from the slum apartment where he'd eaten instant noodles and watched videos of a woman he thought he'd never meet. He thought about the sketchbook under his old mattress filled with love he'd thought was hopeless. He thought about the impossible, miraculous way love had found him anyway. "No," he said, his voice strong and certain. "I'm learning to believe I deserve love. I'm learning to believe good things can happen. I'm learning that broken doesn't mean worthless." That night, Caleb and Sienna stood on the rooftop of her penthouse, the one that had felt like a beautiful prison 6 months ago, and now felt like home because he was in it. The city glittered below them, Washington, D.C. lit up against the night sky. Caleb pulled out the old sketchbook, the one with 147 drawings of her, and handed it to Sienna. She'd seen parts of it before, but never everything. Never the full scope of his years of devotion. She paged through slowly, tears streaming down her face as she saw herself through his eyes. Every angle, every expression, every moment he'd loved her from afar. On the last page, he'd drawn something new. A small house with a porch, 2 figures holding hands surrounded by light. Their future, imagined in pencil and hope. "I love you," Sienna whispered, looking up from the drawing. "You're worth more than gold," Caleb said, pulling her into his arms, holding her against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat. "Worth more than empires, worth everything. You're the reason I'm standing here instead of hiding in poverty. You're the reason I believe in second chances. You're my entire world, Sienna, my entire universe." She tilted her face up, and he kissed her, slow and deep and perfect, tasting forever on her lips. "Marry me," he whispered against her mouth. She pulled back to look at him, her eyes wide. "What?" "I know it's fast. I know I still have nothing material to offer. I don't have a ring. I can't afford the kind of wedding you deserve. I'm still figuring out how to be a functional human being most days." He cupped her face in his hands. "But I want to spend the rest of my life loving you. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to build a life with you, messy and uncertain and real. Will you marry me?" "Yes." She didn't hesitate. He spun her around on the rooftop, both of them laughing and crying, the city lights witnessing their joy. When he set her down, she was breathless and radiant. "I don't need a ring or a fancy wedding, I just need you forever. You have me, completely, forever." They held each other as the city lights shone around them. 2 people who'd found each other across impossible distance, across different worlds, across years of loneliness and fear. Finally home, finally whole, finally free to love without limits. 18 months after that rooftop proposal, Caleb and Sienna were married in a small ceremony at the community center he designed. No press, no spectacle, just the people who mattered. Julian was there with Jasper. Mila served as maid of honor. Jackson walked Sienna down the aisle because her uncle wasn't welcome, and Jackson had become family. Luna and the other kids from Caleb's classes threw wildflowers. It was perfect. Their life together wasn't easy. Caleb still had panic attacks sometimes, triggered by car accidents on the news or memories of Clara. Sienna still struggled with the pressure of running a company while maintaining boundaries. They fought about money, about his reluctance to let her pay for things, about her tendency to solve problems with her checkbook. But they loved each other through it. Messily, imperfectly, completely. Caleb started his own architectural firm, small and focused on community projects. Sienna funded it initially, but within 2 years it was self-sustaining, his designs winning awards and recognition. They bought a small house with a porch, just like the drawing, adopted 2 dogs, and filled their home with art and laughter and the ordinary magic of building a life together. On their 2nd anniversary, Sienna found Caleb in his home studio, sketching. She looked over his shoulder and saw he was drawing her, the way he'd done hundreds of times before they met. "You still do that?" she asked, amused. "I'll never stop," he said, pulling her onto his lap. "You're my favorite thing to draw, my favorite thing to look at, my favorite thing in the whole world." "I love you," she said, kissing his temple. "Thank you for saving me. Both times. In the street, and from the life I was living before I knew real love." "Thank you for saving me back," he said, "for seeing me when I was invisible, for loving me when I thought I was unlovable, for being my second chance at everything." They sat together in the fading afternoon light, the life they'd built surrounding them. Proof that love could bridge any distance, heal any wound, transform any darkness into light. worth more than gold, worth everything. The end. Philosophical lesson. This story teaches us the profound truth of intrinsic architecture. We often spend our lives building penthouses of success, wealth, or perfection, thinking they will protect us from the cold of loneliness. Yet, as Sienna learned, the most expensive walls can still feel like a prison if they aren't filled with truth. Conversely, we may find ourselves in the slums of life like Caleb, believing our scars and our past have rendered us invisible or worthless. The lesson is this: the soul is the only thing that cannot be measured by a market trend or a bank balance. True connection happens not when two perfect versions of people meet, but when one person looks through the cracked screen of life and sees the light in another. We are all architects of our own destiny, but we must be careful not to build monuments to our guilt or our fear. Love is not a transaction. It is a recognition. It is the courage to say, "I see you," when the rest of the world is only looking at what you can do for them. In the end, we don't find happiness by achieving a flawless life. We find it by being brave enough to be broken in front of someone who thinks our pieces are beautiful. Your value is not in what you have built, but in the love you are willing to give, and the grace you are willing to accept. Rate this story from 1 to 10, and comment your favorite moment below. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in my next story. Lots of love.